Welcome back. I'm Sinead, defense economist and investor.
I'm Alex, technology and finance writer and unlicensed aviation enthusiast.
So, Alex, thank you so much. Alex brought over an amazing 2017 bottle of Verdejo wine on Friday night, and we drank it and probably a few too many more bottles of wine, having long discussions about UK wage suppression and Wall Street's short selling, which is fun Friday night shenanigans.
And I also discovered from talking to Sinead just how badly run Ireland is, as we went through everything from sort of slightly shady private property developments through to energy price guarantees and lots more.
Yeah, mostly centered around the movement of brown envelopes.
Yeah, it really put UK political corruption by contrast is usually so kind of lame and low rent that I actually think we could learn something from our neighbours across the sea.
But actually it's funny because I always talk about how in Ireland people are really good at doing stuff, but they just lack the ambition to do it 100%. And we are really, really good at corruption. But I was saying the same thing about the US. Like, what could Ireland be if we looked at the US and kind of embraced it 100%? Like, it's in the shadows at the minute, but why don't we just say, yeah, this place is super corrupt. Let's just go for it, There's something about the shamelessness that's kind of, admirable at a certain stage.
Yeah, I discovered subsequently that there's some Irish slang term that I will definitely butcher pronouncing, so apologies in any advance. It's like something like a cute here or something for a kind of lovable rogue type figure who's
no, sorry, the term Alex is couture.
Couture, not here. Okay, you know what I'm reaching for.
Yeah, we're an island full of coutures for sure.
Not one to take out of context.
Exactly. So this week we woke up this morning and Alex and I saw the news coming out of the United States.
Yes, which was that the US had struck Iranian nuclear facilities using 6 B-2 stealth bombers and 30 Tomahawk missiles in a coordinated overnight operation. It's one of the most significant and, well, in a way, least visible US airstrikes in years. So we felt sort of jumping on the next morning that we should probably talk about what's happened, why it was done this way, what it means that the quietest aircraft in the world has dropped probably the loudest message of deterrence possible.
Yeah, so this is a really great way for me to talk about things I love, like airplanes. So super excited to do a whole episode on the B-2 Spirit, which is this kind of long-range, low observable, extremely stealth bomber that was designed during the Cold War for really these kind of deep penetration strike mission, which we've just seen in Iran. And only 21 of these aircraft were ever produced at a program that cost over $44 billion, which gives it something like more than a $2 billion cost per aircraft. So these are one of the most expensive airframes ever built. And you need to Google or look at the image of this thing. It doesn't even look like an aircraft. It's this kind of flying wing configuration with zero vertical surfaces. And, again, designed to optimize radar cross-section stealth, allowing it to go deep into places like Iran, unnoticed, and I guess do what it did last night.
Yeah, and as you say, it does look like something dreamed up by a conspiracy theorist in an Area 51 basement. So there's no tail, there's no fuselage. It's a sort of sleek black wedge that sort of just absorbs radar, heat, and sound, like it's sort of allergic to being found.
Yeah, so totally. This B-2 came out of this kind of top secret stealth program in the 1980s. It genuinely is one of my favorite aircraft, and it's one that I've never seen in person, and I'm really sad about that. But it was born out of the very famous Skunk Works program in Northrop, just the most amazing stealth, well, not so much anymore, but I worked with a few engineers from the Skunk Works program a few years back, and they were just amazing engineers. But, this was under contract with the US Air Force. So it was designed to do specifically one job, which is to fly undetected into Soviet airspace and kind of dodge surface-to-air missiles, and importantly, drop nuclear bombs in the heart of Moscow, and, all kind of without being spotted or seen. And I guess the thing that allows it to do that is that it has this incredible radar evading design, which was created from these kind of advances in the 1980s in computational capacity. So you kind of had decades of wind tunnel tests driven by what is called computational electromagnetic. So basically the ability to simulate how radar waves bounce off different surfaces using computers. And engineers learned in the 80s that even the smallest angles could light up on an enemy radar. So they designed the B-2's shape to deflect radar energy away, not reflecting it back. So this is why all of the edges of the aircraft, so the wings, the inlets, the control surfaces, are actually angled in parallel, and none of them are vertical, so that they don't create this kind of distinct edge that returns radar directly. So nothing sticks out. And then this kind of ultra radar absorbent black material layered onto the skin, which quite physically sucks up electromagnetic pulses. So this is pretty much as close to being stealthy as our current capability of physics allows us to be.
And it's worth noting that this isn't a solo act, and the design built on earlier stealth prototypes. Like the one I've seen lots of images before is it's kind of F-117 Nighthawk, but the B-2 went further, so larger, longer range, and capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear payloads. So in many ways, it is the final boss of stealth aviation.
Yeah, and this weekend, that kind of Cold War relic became terrifyingly current again. There's been talk over the last couple of weeks as the Iranian intervention has become more of a conversation around the B-2s, whether or not we would see them. And yeah, this weekend we saw that 6 B-2s took off from Missouri and struck Iran's kind of most fortified nuclear bunkers. That included, as we're all now aware, Fordo facility buried 300 feet beneath the mountains. This is Top Gun style. That kind of strike is only possible with something like the B-2.
Yes, because ultimately to hit these kinds of very, very fortified, deeply buried pieces of infrastructure, you need certain capabilities. And the B-2 is the only aircraft in the world that can carry the massive ordnance penetrator, which is this 30,000-pound bunker buster. And I think there are actually only a small handful of these in the world actually exist. And that was used for the first time in live combat during this mission. 12 of them were dropped, which adds up to over 360,000 pounds of explosives delivered without warning.
It's absolutely insane. So what actually happened here? I mean, we're recording this on the Sunday. Very little information has come out. More will become available over the coming days, I'm sure. But as of right now, at around 2 a.m. UK time on Saturday, these 6 B-2 bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. And this is the only base in the world where B-2s are permanently stationed. So it's the kind of the aircraft's spiritual home. It's tucked in the middle of America's heartland. For anyone who has not been to Missouri, I mean, this is in the middle of fucking nowhere, far from prying eyes and kind of very well guarded by, honestly, there's this tightest security in the Air Force.
We could do with some of that in the UK. So if people haven't followed it, it turns out pro-Palestine activists can basically just wander onto RAF bases and vandalize aircraft with no one detaining them. And I suspect you would not be able to pull that routine at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri.
I don't think you'd be getting out of that place alive. Yeah. Not if you're trying to mess with the B-2s.
But yeah, so this mission was a monster, a 30-hour round trip. The bombers flew from Missouri across the Atlantic, past Allied airspace in Europe and the Gulf, and deep into Iranian territory. So this was a direct strike, which means no forward deployment, no island base, no pre-positioned fleet. And that kind of matters. It shows the B-2's unmatched range and reach. They can do mid-air refueling, and often do, but even without it, they can theoretically strike targets just about anywhere on Earth from home soil. And here's the wild part. Each B-2 is flown by just 2 pilots, so there's no rotating crew or in-flight relief. You've got 1 pilot and 1 mission commander in that cockpit, both trained for extreme endurance stealth ops. They eat boxed meals, piss into specially designed bags, and fly without autopilot for much of the mission to preserve the stealth posture. Every few hours, one of them takes a short nap while the other stays alert. It is an insane feat of physical and mental stamina. It's the only equivalent I can think is in some of those. Was it those like U-2 spy planes the US have that fly at that kind of unhumanly high altitude? But sort of other than that,
just quickly on that, there's a really amazing documentary that I watched. Actually, I watched 2 of them back to back recently, and I'll stick them into the show notes. But if you don't know anything about the U-2s, and this might be another episode as well, it's well worth looking at what those aircraft can do.
Yeah, they both fly at an insane altitude, and they also can't sort of land properly from what I remember, because like they're sort of the weight in them is so weirdly distributed.
Exactly, yeah.
Going back to the much slicker B-2, you are essentially flying a $2 billion spaceship through the most dangerous airspace on Earth. And yeah, unsurprisingly, I think that the people who get this gig are handpicked, heavily vetted, and trained for years before flying a single B-2 sortie. And their identities are usually classified during live ops. But yes, I think we can imagine they're calm, surgically precise, and trusted with the kinds of missions that starts or ends wars.
Yeah, I mean, on this kind of human physiology and mental capacity perspective, like I know so many naval Air Force pilots, and they are incredibly I mean they're amazing people, but the wild thing about them is that when you take them out of the aircraft, a lot of them are absolutely totally batshit crazy. But getting back to this mission writ large, so this was not a joint operation with Israel, by the way. I mean, it was certainly coordinated. I mean, you're not able to fly through that airspace and to start this mission without coordination, surely. Israel struck missile and radar sites on the same night. But the B-2s were an American-only asset, flown under U.S. strategic command, and their targets we know to be Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, the three crown jewels of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, which we kind of mentioned on our last episode around trying to start a nuclear weapons program.
Yes, I suspect a nuclear weapons program is not being started in either of those three sites for the foreseeable future, making it even harder for our hypothetical scenario. But breaking this down, so Fordo is the deepest. It's buried under a mountain near the city of Qom, and it's designed to withstand everything short of a nuclear attack. And Iran had moved its centrifuges there to protect them from airstrikes.
Yet Natanz, meanwhile, is the kind of symbol of Iran's uranium enrichment program. Again, go back and listen to our last episode. And it has been targeted before, as I mentioned, famously by the Stuxnet cyber attacks in 2010 that quite literally fried thousands of centrifuges. And this strike has obviously hit it again physically this time, not a cyber attack. And it's the most internationally scrutinized facility. So damaging it, is not just a hypothetical signal. It sends a very real message to both allies and adversaries.
And then Isfahan houses the conversion facilities for turning raw uranium into gas for enrichment, as well as various facilities for missile production, drones, and some R&D hubs. It's this sort of sprawling complex when you look at the satellite imagery. And crippling Isfahan hits both Iran's nuclear program, but also paralyzes its broader military-industrial base.
And all of this was done with, this incredible mix of stealth and shock and surgical precision. By the time Iranian radars even noticed that these aircraft were in Iran, the bombs were already inside the mountain. And reports suggest that Fordo's tunnel system has collapsed and Isfahan's centrifuges were vaporized. And Natanz, already wounded from this kind of decade of sabotage, was left smoldering.
And then, just to add insult to injury, around 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from US Navy submarines operating in the Persian Gulf, which can carry dozens of vertically launched missiles while remaining completely undetectable. And these strikes targeted support infrastructure around the nuclear sites, radar installations, communications relays, and decoy facilities meant to confuse satellite surveillance, although for the last couple of weeks I'm surprised many of those are still standing. And here's why the economics matter. So a Tomahawk costs around $1.5 million per missile. You may have remembered at various points with the Houthis in Yemen, people kept saying that the US was shooting down $100 quadcopters with $1.5 million missiles. Well, it was these missiles. And in most cases, these missiles sound expensive until you realize that it's essentially doing the job of a manned fighter sortie, but without risking pilots, needing air cover, or triggering a broader air war. And the submarines also don't require forward basing or regional permission. They can loiter for weeks, strike on command, and just vanish. So think of last night not just as a single bombing run, but as a theatre-wide precision strike coordinated across air and sea domains, designed not to just destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, but also to delay any response, deny counterattack, and disable reconstruction. It is warfare at its most efficient.
Yeah, and Alex, regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree, and there's wide-ranging disagreements amongst the legitimacy of this attack, this is quite extraordinary. And this is, I guess, a part of the US that we haven't seen in a long time because, well, anyone that's involved in the US DoD in the way that I am certainly only hears about the ineptitude of the US and the inability of the US to coordinate or to do anything. And I think this really was an extremely strong show and demonstration of what the US is, in fact, capable of doing under very short notice. The B-2 is kind of a symbol of this because the B-2 itself is incredibly old technology. I mean, it first flew the year I was born, and I'm no spring chicken anymore. Yet here we are 35 years later, and not Russia, not China, not even the US again, although maybe this points to its increasing in amplitude, has built anything better than this. And that's because stealth isn't just about shape, it's also about material science. As I said, the black material on the B-2 quite literally absorbs the electromagnetic pulses and thermal suppression and kind of low observable coatings and aerodynamic compromise. And this kind of system level design takes decades to kind of create and billions of dollars to perfect. And we haven't seen that this has happened since the B-2 program.
And yeah, let's talk about those billions. My understanding is the original plan was to build 132 B-2s, but after the Cold War, and therefore all of history ended, the Clinton administration slashed that number to 21. So that's how we got the per unit cost of $2.1 billion you were mentioning earlier.
Right. So it's not that each plane literally costs $2 billion to build. I mean, God, they're really not that expensive, but it's more that the entire program, the infrastructure, the materials research, the kind of black box avionics and the stealth development, a lot of it actually, which is done in Boston in one of the MIT laboratories, this kind of got amortized over just 21 aircraft. So, I mean, like imagine spending your entire personal fortune developing a phone and then, selling 21 of them. That's essentially the B-2.
And then there's the operating costs. So the B-2 costs roughly $150,000 per flight hour to operate. That's fuel, crew, maintenance, mission support. Every time one flies a global sortie, it racks up millions in these costs because, these things are basically aerospace divas. They need climate-controlled hangars, specialized low observable skin repairs, and constant attention.
Yeah, and that $150 per flight hour to operate, which is insanely high, is because each aircraft requires 119 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight. This is really not metaphorical. I mean, it's literally the ground crew effort to keep it operational. Again, you need to actually look at an image or watch a video of these aircraft flying to really start to understand how high tech they are. I mean, despite their age, you have to reapply the radar absorbent coatings every time that you've flown it. You have to repair minute thermal discrepancies because those thermal discrepancies is what literally bounces off the radar systems to show your enemy that you're there. You got to check classified electronic systems and even realigning its weirdly fragile trailing edges. Like you got to sand down those edges. Any edge is a sign to the enemy that you are there and waiting to be found.
Yeah. And yes, it's easy to hear all of this and go, well, okay, this is just insane defense gold plating at its very worst. Why don't we do something cheaper? But if you tried to replicate that same strike using conventional aircraft from overseas bases, you'd need dozens of F-15s or F-35s, aerial refueling tankers, suppression of enemy air defenses, forward basing permissions, diplomatic overhead, like the whole ecosystem. I think it would be very, very hard to keep it a secret that you were planning to do this because all of these moving parts would be essentially visible from space, but also it would cost 10 to 20 times more and take weeks to coordinate.
The B-2 actually kind of looks cheap, so it's a faster, cleaner option because if you don't have a B-2, I mean, my God. So my favorite movie in the world is Top Gun. My second favorite movie in the world is Top Gun Maverick. And yeah, this movie is quite literally about what happens when you try to do the mission that the B-2 has just done with your F-15s. I mean, if you have not seen this movie, please go and watch it right now, like today. But I mean, in this movie, you basically have dozens of fighter jets weaving through canyons at low altitude, dodging radar, dodging surface to air missiles, trying to hit a vent shaft the size of a tennis ball, all while the enemy's kind of fifth gen fighters are circling overhead. And that's what this mission would have looked like without the B-2. Very risky, very messy and cinematic, but in, the worst ways possible. In real life, this really is a logistics nightmare, and it dramatically increases chance of failure, escalation, and, casualties on all sides. So the B-2 doesn't need this canyon run. It literally just flies in at 40,000 feet undetected, drops the bomb on the target and leaves. This aircraft is halfway home before anyone realizes that something has happened.
Yeah, so the B-2 might be old, but it's not obsolete. It's a strategic ghost of the Cold War still haunting modern battlefields. And yeah, I suppose this is bad for Tom Cruise. This sounds deeply uncinematic.
It's boring for anyone that loves Top Gun. If you're into your naval aircraft, this is going to send you to sleep. But this strike really wasn't just about disabling Iran's nuclear facilities. Let's kind of zoom out here a little bit and think about the bigger picture other than the B-2 itself. I mean, this was a signal to Iran, yes, but as we have seen recently to Russia, China, North Korea, I mean, the US has increasingly been under pressure and widespread discussions around its ineffectiveness. And so this probably was a great way for the US to kind of show up and say, hey, we are still actually the world's leading military superpower. We may not always be, but right now we are still in that pole position.
Yes, and I think, as we were kind of touching on before, there was no US carrier strike group involved in this operation, which would normally be unthinkable because carriers have historically been the backbone of US force projection, these floating air bases that bring jets, surveillance, electronic warfare, refueling, and rescue capabilities into theatre. And at any time, the US has about 2 to 3 carriers deployed globally. One might be in the Mediterranean, another in the Pacific, and occasionally one rotates through the Arabian Sea. If we'd needed a carrier for this mission, it would likely have come from the Fifth Fleet's areas of operation based out of Bahrain, or we'd have had to reposition one from CENTCOM's staging areas in Diego Garcia or the Indian Ocean. And that takes days, sometimes weeks.
And aircraft carriers are honestly the most fascinating and miraculous piece of technology, but also a piece of military policy that exists. And this is definitely something that we should absolutely discuss in a future episode. They're really fascinating, and I've actually done quite a bit of work on naval carriers in the past. But just to put this into perspective, okay, so look at Operation Odyssey Dawn in 2011, and this was when the US and NATO forced a no-fly zone over Libya. That campaign involved hundreds of strike sorties, Tomahawks from submarines and destroyers, and crucially the USS Enterprise carrier group positioned in the Mediterranean. There's actually quite a good documentary on the USS Enterprise group. I'll try and find it and stick it in the show notes. But it took days to set up and required coordination with European allies for basing and overflight. You know, trying to coordinate anything with Europe is not easy. The same thing in Operation Desert Fox in 1998, a 4-day bombing campaign against Iraq's weapons of mass destruction facilities that famously required aircraft carriers in the Gulf, plus the land-based bombers in Kuwait and Diego Garcia. All of this requiring hundreds of personnel to organize, taking days, weeks, potentially even months to get together.
And then there's the hardware message. So only the US has the massive ordnance penetrator, or the MOP, and only the B-2 can deliver it. So this is also the US reminding us that it's the only country that can credibly threaten deeply buried nuclear infrastructure and then follow through.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, let's not forget that the MOP is the largest weapon that can be used pre-nuclear, and only the US has this weapon, and only the US has the carrier for this weapon, which is the B-2. Historically, the US has used visible bomber deployments before. So the B-52s to Guam, the B-1s to Qatar, as this kind of show of force. But the B-2 is so different from this because this is not about a visible show of force. It's quite literally the opposite. It's about an invisible, irreversible, and kind of deniable until it's over type of force. And this ambiguity adds leverage.
And from a deterrent standpoint, that's absolutely critical. So Iran now has to assume that any high-value target, and I suspect they're starting to run out of those, but any remaining high-value targets, no matter how hardened or remote, is vulnerable, which forces them to spread assets, invest in deeper redundancy, like buy the Ayatollah a faster getaway car, and think twice about overt moves.
If your Range Rovers, not Range Rovers, land...
It's the Toyota Land Cruiser. I think the Iranian regime has somewhat more expensive taste than the Yemeni warlords we were talking about a few episodes ago, but you never know.
Well, go over with a few Land Cruisers and see how far you can get. But this is a good question. I mean, the Ayatollah is in his getaway car, but what actually happens next? The strike was clean, fast, and surgical, which is not something that we usually associate with anything that Trump does. Of course, there was the usual chaos that surrounded it. I mean, I think he had kind of said, we need unconditional surrender, followed by we may or may not strike, followed by we're going to have the 2 weeks to think about it, followed by immediate strikes. So, chaos abound. But what happens? We have this field full of questions now. Does Iran retaliate? Does it escalate? Does it absorb the blow and re-strategize? I mean, this uncertainty is now the kind of strategic terrain that we find ourselves in.
The real risk is probably not a direct missile exchange. I think in part because Iran is increasingly just running out of the ability to do these. I mean, when the kind of exchanges of missiles started Friday before last, the first Iranian wave was sort of huge. You'd like 100 missiles, a kind of wave of drones. Increasingly, when you look at kind of Iran's strikes on Israel, sort of the drones have steadily diminished about 20 to 30 missiles at a time, which I think is a product of both slowly diminishing stockpiles, but also so many of their launchers have now been struck that even if they have sort of more in the tank, if you've got no vehicle from which to launch it, it becomes somewhat academic. So instead, the threat Iran poses is likely an asymmetric response. So it theoretically still has options that aren't headline grabbing, but are deeply destabilizing. It could sort of opt for drone attacks on US forces in Iraq or Syria, which would be a very dangerous move from their standpoint. Maybe cyber operations, or I think quite a lot of the facilities they used to conduct those have also been bombed in the last couple of weeks. Or their kind of old favorite, which is maritime disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, or hoping that their somewhat diminished proxies in Lebanon or Gaza can lend them a hand.
Isn't this really the threat of entering the Middle East in this kind of heavy-handed military capacity, that we know that asymmetric response is the most likely, and it's also the one that the US is least able to counter? This certainly complicates things for Israel as well. I mean, their strategic position is clearly stronger now. The US has done what Israel alone could not do, was able to strike Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan with impunity. But that strength comes at a cost. Israel's hand is kind of now exposed. They've spent years pushing for US military involvement. And now that this has finally happened, they might actually have to bear the brunt of political and military backlash in the region. And we just don't really know what that's going to look like yet.
I think that's fair. And it's important to also remember how Israel's armed forces were kind of designed, is that Israel's sort of defense strategy is sort of designed for short wars against its neighbors, either these kind of like short, like couple of months long operations in somewhere like Gaza, or pushing back kind of immediate invasion as it has done at various points in its history. Israel's defense posture has never been designed on the basis of extended multi-year deployments in different theaters in the Middle East. And I think even the kind of extended operation in Gaza has been stretching Israel economically to some degree. Beefing with multiple neighbors at once could sort of pose a strain, even if like none of those individual neighbors is sort of strong enough to kind of defeat it on the battlefield. And where Iran can be damaging is even if it doesn't retaliate directly against the US, we've already seen that they are, that they have chosen to target Israeli cities or infrastructure. And maybe because they can't, or maybe they're not particularly interested in what or who they hit while they do that. And yeah, this could go along for a long time, both like racking up damages, forcing people to be constantly running for shelter, and slowly exhausting Israel's stock of interceptors. And I think that's ultimately the ambiguity built into this kind of operation, that while the bombs are American, the consequences may not be.
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there with the paradox of kind of strategic success. The strike was no doubtedly successful as far as we are aware right now. Again, we don't have the full information yet, but what we do know about it was that it was fast, quiet, tactically very clean. It was executed in the way that it was very much designed to be executed. But I mean, this kind of long tail of uncertainty is what might actually kill the longer programmatic mission here. So diplomatic, economic, military uncertainty. Does Iran accelerate its nuclear ambitions? TBD. Is it able to? We're not sure. Again, listen to our last episode on what that might look like. Do Gulf states head towards China? This is a real risk. This is going to be a difficult one for the US over the next decade or two. Do proxy groups escalate? The thinking here 6 to 12 months ago would have been yes. Those proxy groups are obviously much weaker, Alex, as you mentioned, than they were before. That doesn't mean, though, however, just because they do not have the capability to escalate right now, that does not mean that they do not have the will to do that. And that, as we know in the Middle East, tends to be particularly long, determined will. So I think whatever happened over the weekend may have been very fast and clean. I think what comes next is going to be much longer and harder to understand.
Yeah. And ultimately, whatever the questions for the US or Israel, I'd still much rather be sat in Tel Aviv or DC right now than in Tehran, because if you're in the Iranian position, you don't have a lot of good options as you're outgunned, your economy is fucked, your population increasingly just hates you, which has been going on for a while.
If you're the regime.
Yes, to be clear, is that, yes, like if you are, the Ayatollahs have not been beloved of the population for a while. And when Iranians last had the chance to go to the polls, they elected the most moderate presidential candidate they were allowed to under the system. And as we were touching on, the proxies, while enthusiastic, have lost their ability to convincingly project power. So obviously Hamas still exists as a force, but it's confined to Gaza. Hezbollah is in a sort of uneasy ceasefire and has indicated that it can't respond for the moment. Only the Houthi bit of the kind of axis of resistance is still alive, but beyond its ability to lob missiles at individual bits of shipping, which is deeply annoying and expensive and disruptive, like they don't really have the ability to escalate beyond that.
I mean, I do think there's something to that. I mean, again, go back and listen to our episode on Yemen, but I do think with the Houthis, what we learned there was that the US, I guess the financial commitment that it took to try to outmaneuver the Houthis that they were not able to, I guess, execute fully on, is in some respects a show of what we might be facing for the next ill-determined period within the Middle East now. We know that the US is not good at kind of fighting asymmetric battles, especially with the heavy kind of machinery of military that it has around those bases. You know, I don't think the Houthis are as capable as, you know, local, let's say, Iranian allies would want them to be. But I do think what we saw recently was that they are able to do significant economic damage on their enemies.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I don't, to be clear, think that we're set for a kind of Middle East of peace and prosperity and happiness where children of all different sects join hands and sing. I think Iran is not going to pose the sort of profile of threat we thought it would in the 2010s, because nuclear ambiguity plus regional proxies, that formula has basically imploded. Do I think that it has still, you know, ongoing asymmetric conflict in that part of the world has the potential to be both costly in terms of money and lives? For sure. Completely agree.
And I want to bring this back to conclude on the topic of today's episode, which is the B-2. I mean, for all of the discussion, there is a lot in the world that I live in of kind of defense economics, of just how the nature of asymmetric warfare is changing the economics of all of this. Nearly every data point shows that asymmetric warfare basically comes down to cheap drones. Being able to counter US naval carriers has kind of changed conflict forever. But enter the B-2. And I think the B-2 is a good example of where, yes, sure, it's old technology, but it's the best technology in the world for exactly this type of mission. And there's no asymmetric response to the B-2 as of yet. And I think as long as the US still has that capability, China, Russia, there's no other country that has been able to make any kind of developmental progress towards having a B-2 capability. I think that's important. I think that the US ultimately still has the upper hand.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you. And it does drive me up the walls. And Elon was very into this kind of thing of people going like, why do we still have fighter jets and bombers anymore? A drone swarm could do that for you.
Don't even get me.
I know, it's like who needs aircraft carriers anymore? All this kind of tier of discourse. So yeah, I agree.
So yeah, like the B-2 was not just a delivery system; it's a signal, and I think the signal is going to be a very strong one. As much as the kind of the nature of asymmetrical warfare has changed how we think about the cost of conflict, I think this is going to be one of the biggest counter signals to the many years of asymmetric warfare that we've had that says, no, actually, you know, B-2s still exist and they're still able to counter anything that we've seen in conflict so far. So this is a signal about what the US can do and when it chooses not to ask permission.
Yeah, I think we should probably wrap up there, Sinead. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yes, and we are definitely going to be staying on top of this topic as we get more information about it over the coming days and weeks. Until then, goodbye.